Is by Dr. Rob Brander. Dr. Brander is a professor in the School of Biological Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of New South Wales here in Sydney, Australia. Rob's background is in coastal geomorphology, and he is one of the world's foremost experts in the rip current hazard. In the last decade, Rob has pivoted a little bit, and his research interests have moved more into the field of beach safety research, which he's going to talk about today. And he studies now topics related to rips, but also beachgoer knowledge and behavior in relation to safety, practice, and hazards. So Rob's going to present his talk, Bridging the Gap Between Research Technology and Beach Safety Operations. Rob, go ahead whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thanks, Will. All right, so thanks everybody for joining this conference, and I'd like to thank all the people that Will thanked, but mostly I'd like to thank Will, because putting this together was a massive effort, and it's hard to describe just how much time Will has spent on this. So a big thanks to you, Will. And I guess one of the interesting, here we go, start my video.
There he is.
Yeah, Will has introduced me, so I won't introduce myself anymore, but what's interesting is that I'm not a technology person at all. I barely even know how to use my phone. So the question is, well, why am I starting off this conference with this particular talk? Well, I'm what I call myself now a beach safety researcher, and I think the purpose of my talk today is to give you an overview of what beach safety research is, why it's important, provide some examples, and describe how beach technology can not only help beach safety research, but also help lifeguards in general. And I am biased because I am a scientist and a researcher, but my argument would be that research really underpins and validates the value of a lot of what we do in respect to drowning and injury prevention. And hopefully that will translate into technology as well. And here's Bondi Beach, just as a nice starting point. Okay. I would say, and there's a number of scientists doing it, and a lot of them are actually in attendance today. And I just wrote a little chapter in a coastal encyclopedia just to kind of define what it is. And beach safety research is really a mixed methods approach, so it involves multi-disciplines, involves physical sciences, social sciences, methods, analysis, but really it's all about combining this type of information and these type of approaches to really try and improve our understanding of the various issues, many of which are complex, related to beach safety. So it involves elements of studying the physical behavior of the hazards themselves. It looks at the types of beaches that we have and how they behave. It also needs to focus on how humans behave and how humans interact with the beach, what they understand, what they don't understand. It has elements of epidemiology, incident reporting, and risk and science communication. So it really is a wide-ranging field. And I want to make this point. A lot of people never really see the value of what scientists and researchers do. But, you know, I can go and talk to lifeguards, which I often do, and ask them what I think is your main problem at the beach. And they can say, well, the main problem is rip currents. You know, most of our rescues are rip currents. They're happening at these times of days, and these are the people who are getting in trouble. That's great. And I absolutely believe any information the lifeguards tell me. But it's not particularly useful unless it's evidence-based and you have data to support your knowledge. So that's really what beach safety research does. It provides this evidence-based platform for understanding beach safety issues even more. So a really good beach safety research study is going to look at some of the physical factors of beaches. It's going to look at the type of the beach, the behavior, the existence of rip currents. It's going to look at various environmental controls like waves and tides, and currents and breaking waves. Maybe those studies will link those to the social factors, or maybe they'll look at that in isolation, because scientifically, you know, we have a pretty good understanding of how beaches behave. We also have a pretty good understanding how rip currents behave, which is, of course, one of the main hazards on surf beaches. But what we don't have as good an understanding of are the social factors. We don't nearly know as much as we should about people who use the beach. We don't know their swimming ability, where they're from. We don't know if they actually go in the water, what they understand about common beach safety hazards, what they understand about beach flags. We just don't know that much. And we don't really understand, you know, are they responding to signage? And these are huge questions, and it varies around the world depending on where you are and culturally as well. And we don't know how important is the presence of lifeguards to people when they go to the beach. Do they naturally assume they're there? or do they just go to any beach and not really care? And also, beach safety research involves looking at the types of education we do to try and keep people safe. And there's very different, many forms of that, but is it effective? So beach safety research covers a lot of stuff, and this is the crux. This is a diagram I've used for a number of years. Beach safety research really tries to solve what I call information disconnects. So we have a lot of good beach safety research going on around the world. But until recent times, a lot of these scientists have been kind of working in isolation. They're doing their research and it kind of stays with them. What really needs to happen is that information needs to be communicated to beach safety practitioners, lifeguard organizations, whatever. And these two groups need to really work together to sort of drive each other's own needs and goals. So there's often been an information disconnect there where they're not working together. And there needs to be that two-way communication. And then ultimately, it's really up to beach safety practitioners and organizations to communicate knowledge to beachgoers themselves and to try and have lifeguard services to keep beachgoers safe. But that needs to be done using best practice, and the information that's communicated, it should be correct, should be consistent. But you've always got the other challenge where we don't always know how good the information going to the beachgoers is, but we also don't know much if the beachgoers are actually paying attention to that information. And the final disconnect is really there's a big gap between what beach safety research is doing and what the public knows about it, which is virtually nothing. And there's very few examples of scientists or researchers who are engaging directly with the public. But I sort of think if we kind of tackle all of these disconnects, that is really going to have a long-term impact on reducing beach drowning and injury, which is what we're all about. And that includes beach safety researchers. And in terms of this conference, I think technology has a big role to play in addressing each and every one of those disconnects. So I'm just going to run through some examples, just to give you some examples of some of the beach safety research that's been done. And, some of this is mine because I'm more familiar with it. But about 10 years ago, maybe a little bit more, these instruments, if you like, called GPS drifters were designed and built. And these are designed to float in the water like a person would float. And you put a GPS on them and you throw them in rips. This is a rip current at Bondi Beach, and you track where they go. And this is some data that was done from a PhD thesis by Jack McCarroll, who's now back in Australia. And we seeded this beach, which was Whale Beach in Sydney's northern beaches, with about 30 drifters, for most of a tidal cycle. And you just have this unprecedented ability to map the circulation on a beach. So this is looking down at the beach. We had one rip against the headland here, one in the middle of the beach, and down here. Just unbelievably advanced our knowledge of rip current science. And there's other researchers, plenty of researchers using drifters around the world. But what was interesting was we combined that with testing escape strategies. How do you get out of a rip? Because there's been a long debate. Should you swim parallel to the beach? Should you float? What should you do? So as part of these experiments, we carried the drifters in, but we also had people go in with GPS, and some of them swam parallel, some of them floated. And I won't go over all the results, but everything's complex when it comes to the beach. And this is looking down on a beach, and this is a rip current that 100% of the time circulated around, and everyone who floated just ended up safe and sound in the sandbar. 150 meters down the beach was a rip current against a rock reef, and everyone who floated ended up a long way offshore and didn't recirculate back. And we found similar things with swimming parallel. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't work. It just depends on the nature of the rip current circulation, and Jack McCarroll wrote this up in the journal Natural Hazards. But that describes the strategies based on these experiments. It has nothing to do with what people feel comfortable with doing when they're caught in a rip current. What do they want to do? And so we extended the study and we did surveys and interviews of people who'd actually been caught in rip currents. And we looked at good swimmers, weak swimmers, and the findings of this study were quite interesting because they basically showed the same thing, that floating works for some people, swimming works for other people. But the net result of these studies was that there's no single piece of advice that seems to work in terms of escaping in all situations for all people. And that influenced the advice that Surf Life Saving Australia, who was involved in the research, started promoting to the public. And it's also influenced rip current safety advice around the world. So beach safety research can have a global impact. Now, another aspect of beach safety research is it very much is about the who, where, when, how, what, and why of beach safety problems. And Surf Life Saving Australia is very good at compiling all the coastal drowning statistics every year, and they produce a national report. So you can see how many coastal drownings there were last year, 86% male. You can see the cause of the rescues, where they occurred around Australia, how it's varied over time, and locationally where it's going on. This is your platform for identifying the scope of your drowning problem. That absolutely is crucial, but it relies on good data. And while this is good at telling people what the problem is, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. So the next step of beach safety research is to focus on particular aspects of hazard. So maybe you focus on the rip current hazard. Maybe you focus on surf zone injuries. And if you have access to a very high quality data set, for example, this one in Costa Rica, they were actually really able to get an understanding of where the rip current problem was happening and who it was happening to. And now you've got some fantastic work going on in France, led by Bruno Castel and some of his colleagues who are using lifeguard data to examine the occurrence of surf zone injuries around France, but also trying to relate that to environmental controls like the waves and tides. Because if we can find there's a link between when these incidents occur to environmental controls, well, that allows us to in future have some sort of predictive and forecasting capabilities. The what and why of beach safety problems really gets into the people, so beachgoer behavior. And more studies are starting to do surveys of people on beaches just to find out what they're all about, what they know, what they don't know about beach safety. This one was an Australian study done almost a decade ago, and this one was a more recent one looking at students in Spain. So this is information we need to gather globally. What are your beachgoers all about? What do they know? And there's a strong psychological aspect to beach safety research as well. A paper came out recently talking about what we call confirmation bias. And this is all about people. And the idea here is that you show up at a beach, there's a rip current there. You might not even know there's a rip, but you're more likely not to go swimming when there's no one around. But if there's people around, there's people in the water, you're with your friends, you're probably going to go swimming. So there's a strong psychological component. The what and why, there's also been a lot of attention paid to rip current identification. How good are people at spotting rip currents? And there's plenty of studies that have shown that most people aren't very good at spotting rip currents. And there's a recent study that came out of New Zealand led by Sebastian Pittman, where he actually went to a beach in New Zealand and showed people pictures of rip currents. And even people who were good at spotting rip currents in the pictures weren't actually very good at actually spotting a rip that was on the beach. And this has all sorts of implications in terms of how do we educate people about rip currents spotting? Do we show them pictures? Do we show them video? And this is where technology can come in as well. We've even done studies related to beach signage. What is effective in terms of communicating to people? And there's plenty of signage varies around the world. We have to have signs, but there's plenty of studies that have shown they're not as effective as authorities think they may be. So that's an overview of beach safety research, but how can technology help all of this? Well, one, it can provide us with a massive amount of data that doesn't exist at the moment. Two, it can provide us with a massive amount of good quality, high quality spatial and temporal data that can just open doors from a research perspective. If we can access data that doesn't exist now, we can start to answer a lot of these questions that we're still a bit unsure about. So it can overcome data acquisition challenges. And the whole goal of beach safety research is really to come up with some outcomes that are useful to the public, useful for future beach safety education, useful to lifeguard operations. But we want them to be validated. So how does this all relate to what we're going to talk about in the conference today? Well, as we'll describe, there's 4 primary themes and breakout sessions. One is related to predictive modeling and forecasting. And I don't want to jump ahead and steal Greg Dusick's thunder. But for example, he's going to talk about this operational model that's just been released in the United States, where you can sort of click on these icons. It takes you to a location and it gives you a probability forecast of your rip current risk that's actually based on environmental controls at the time. So this is huge. Technology, if it can help us predict when and where we think conditions are going to be dangerous, that is absolutely massive in terms of helping people as well as lifeguard operations. You're going to hear stories or talks about crowd counting, which is a bit of a thing at the moment. All lifeguards do some sort of estimates of crowd counts. We know that it's very difficult to get accurate crowd counts, but knowing how many people on the beach is important from an exposure point of view to any particular hazards, but also you know, what's the point of having 6 lifeguards on duty on a cloudy day when there's no one there? Maybe you should extend lifeguard hours because there's more people at a beach later in the evening. There's all sorts of ramifications and implications for beach counting in terms of, should you have a lifeguard on a patrol beach? So you'll see some talks on that topic. And this is the big one as well. Well, I think it's a big one. Will's bias too. So all lifeguards collect data. From a research perspective, getting high quality lifeguard data is gold. This is what we need. Lifeguards have the potential to gather so much useful information. And Will did a study. He did a survey of data collection practices of lifeguards around the world and basically found that, you know, we all agree it's important, but there's a lot of inconsistency there. And there's challenges. Lifeguards are busy. They're not always able to collect data. So one of the big challenges that technology can overcome is making data collection easier for lifeguards. And then finally, you know, we want to make beachgoers safer. And one of the best ways to do that is to empower them with knowledge. So how do we make that happen? How do we educate beachgoers? How do we motivate them to learn about these things? And yes, I mentioned signs before. We have to have signs on beaches. Is there a way that technology can make better signs? You know, many of us go out and we actually face-to-face educate people about beach safety and rip currents. But what technique is going to work? Is the old standard stand up and talk technique good, or can we use something like virtual reality? But most importantly, what's most effective? And that applies for any of these themes. We're going to use technology to help reduce drowning and injury on beaches. What is the most effective technology and ways about it? So I'm just going to leave you with this. We're sort of where I started. My final thought is we're all about trying to reduce beach drowning and injury. We need to solve these disconnects and make them better as much as possible, and technology can do that. But what technology is going to be useful? There's plenty of technology out there, but is it going to be a technology that's just sort of like a bit of a toy, or is it going to be technology that's going to have some real value and real world outcomes? So I'll just stop there, and maybe there's some time for questions.
Rob, I think we're just going to power on through. If you do have a question for Rob, go ahead and drop it in the chat or in the Q&A, and we will bring it up later in the panel discussion, or maybe Rob can just write back to you in the chat.